The Data Hot Seat. Hello, data friends. Great to see you again. Welcome back to the Data Hot Seat, the podcast where we cut through the noise, ask the awkward questions, and occasionally geek out harder than we probably should. I'm your host, Paul McComish from Advancing Analytics, where the coffee is strong, the opinions are stronger, and we've been busy getting our heads around everything that came out of the Databricks Data and AI Summit. Now, if you've been following along, you'll know we started working our way through some of the big announcements from San Francisco. And today we're landing on one that I think is genuinely exciting and possibly a little underrated given everything that dropped that week. We're talking about Omnigent. At its simplest, Omnigent is an open source meta orchestration layer for AI agents. Think of it as the thing that sits above your agent frameworks and lets you orchestrate across all of them from one place. Now, that might sound like a niche infrastructure problem, but if you're building agents at any kind of scale, this one matters. To help me dig into it, I've got the brilliant Adam Lammiman joining me today from Advancing Analytics. So let's get into it. A very warm welcome to Adam, who joins us in the Data Hot Seat. For those who don't know you, who are you and what do you do?
All right, thanks. So I'm Adam Lammiman. I'm a principal at Advancing Analytics. I'm probably not an atypical sort of data engineer type person in the sense that my main part of my career has been mostly within software development. So I started off in web development in the late 90s, and then I've wandered through different parts of software and data engineering. I've done lots of stuff with like large enterprise systems, lots of web development over, 10 or so years. And then I decided a few years ago, like just before I came here, that I really wanted to, this felt like the new ground, the place where everything was sort of opening up. I really wanted to get some experience in that. So I sort of, I talked to Terry. Terry had worked with one of my previous companies before and ended up getting a job here. So I often say that I've come over to the dark side. So there's a strange dichotomy between data engineering and software engineering where we both look across the divide at each other slightly critically. And so I feel like I've sort of crossed that Rubicon now, and I'm on the other side.
Okay, so we're here to talk about Databricks announcements, specifically Omnigent. But before we get into Omnigent, it's all agent related. Agents are the big thing at the moment, revolutionizing the entire world. There's quite a story behind them, isn't there?
Yeah. And I think, again, for me, it's really interesting because I started my career at this sort of point of tipping where the web exploded and became this thing, right? And you can sort of see that people that have been doing programming within industry, obviously it existed for decades beforehand, right? But it opened up all these doors and all these other people sort of streamed in. All these businesses started to try and monetize and figure out how to, utilize this amazing new technology. And it became a sort of almost like liminal space between two eras, right? And you had this really sort of shifting period where no one quite knew how it was all working. And I really feel like this is where we are now. This is the same thing happening again, but in a slightly different context. I think the real difference though is that where the internet was very much there was almost people might forget this, but at the very beginning of the internet, there was almost like this back end of the 60s sort of hippie vibe about it, right? It was very much like everything is, the information is free, everything is free, we're not making money out of any of this. And then you could also watch the technology sort of trying to adapt, right? When I first started, there was a web page with you had very static stuff. You were hard coding all these values into this sort of HTML, and then people invented JavaScript, and that was invented off the back of someone doing it over a weekend, right? And that's become one of the biggest languages in the world. But it was very much done not in an attempt to monetize it, but really just to sort of try and solve all these problems, right? That were sort of becoming apparent as people were trying to do more things. You want to make your web pages more interactive. The difference I think now is you have a lot of companies that have invested a lot of money in a lot of things, and they really want you to use those things. And so there is the very real, this is changing everything, and these things are sort of shifting the way that we work very, very, very quickly, right? And I think that's the other thing that sort of confuses people, because there's such a vast amount of change. If you think where we were at the beginning of this year to where we are now, and that's not slowing down. But there's also a financial incentive for people to use these things, right? They need to be used, and the companies behind them need to sell them to people. So us as professionals sort of in the middle, right, where you've got senior management saying, hey, we need to do this stuff. Everything needs to be agentic, right? Everyone needs to start using these things. And they're sort of throwing them at people without really sort of saying, well, how are you actually going to use this stuff well? There's all the companies themselves that are like hyping this stuff up because they need to hype it, because they want you to use it and buy it and
I
say,
think
hey,
they've
you
done
can
a
use
good
it.
job of hyping it up as well.
Well,
You see the words agentic everywhere, and some people have no idea what it means.
Well, exactly. And it becomes like a sort of overloaded term, right? And also, like, you know, there's also like part of that marketing is scaremongering, right? Is like, yeah, hey, you know, they're going to take over the world. Hey, we're going to build like AGMs and everybody's going to, you know, like, you know, they're going to be Skynet, or like everyone's going to lose their jobs because no one's going to need to program anymore, right? And we're sort of sat here at the moment in the middle trying to work out how much of that is like, you know, the industry trying to sort of sell their product and build a hype around it. How much of it is genuinely like useful and what we should be doing, and like, you know, what things do we need to sort of take regard of and ignore. Do you know what I mean? And you know, and also deal with all the sort of emotional side of it as well, because like everybody's like, I've done this for like, you know, 20 odd years and I really liked parts of my job, and that's just changing very rapidly. But I think the only way you survive in this type of industry is to be open to change, right? That's the bit I like about it, is that it changes like all the time and you have to learn new things. So this is just another one of those new things you need to learn, but it's just like, you know, how do you put all these different things? As soon as you get comfortable with one thing, someone else has released something else that changes it again. Do you know what I mean? And you're just constantly trying to sort of catch up.
We've seen that as well. I mean, recently there was a lot of hype around Claude and Mythos and how they were only releasing it out to a few people.
I know. Yeah. And if you dig into that, a lot of that stuff in there, they were saying you could already do with the earlier models, but they were just, you know, but again, that's the weird thing where it's really hard to unpick this stuff, right? Because on the one hand, you want these companies to be sort of, you know, you want them to be careful with these types of things because there is real risks with what they're doing. But on the other hand, there's that sort of hype machine as well that is like potentially escalating the level of those risks to make it seem more powerful than it is. And that's the weird thing, right? I mean, where have you ever seen someone trying to sell you something by telling you how dangerous it is? But that's effectively what they're doing. Do you know what I mean? It's like...
it makes a great news story when you see it on like BBC News and the average person looking at this thing, oh my God, they've created... Like you said earlier, they created Skynet. What are we going to do? You know?
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, right, this is genuinely changing our industry under our feet, right? And there is no doubt about that. You cannot look at this and say this is all complete hype. You know, there is a level of change here that is true, but it's us trying to work out how we navigate through that is the important thing, and to try and work out what is relevant for us and what is actually, you know, worth us sort of paying attention to.
So we got loads of this stuff going on. We could probably do a whole data hot seat. I probably will do a whole data hot seat where we just talk about nothing but agentic. So we are here to talk about Omnigent. So how does it fit into it all?
So again, I think this is where like you see this sort of rapid transformation happening, right? So if you think about where we started with sort of agentic workflows, you know, you've got your level of sort of IntelliSense, right, which is where they sort of started working well. You know, initially it was like you asked them something and they gave you sort of some kind of thing. It looked all right, but it wasn't great. And, you know, people like myself can sort of turn their nose up in some sort of snobbish manner and go, oh, hey, you know, it's not as good as we are, right? And then that's gradually improved over time. And then you get that sort of IntelliSense point where you're typing something and it starts to fill in what you want. And you're like, yeah, that's good. That obviously then progresses into sort of plan-based like development, right? Where you're writing out a plan, you're clearly sort of planning out the thing, and then you're handing that over to the agent to then do the code for you, and you're reviewing it. And you're still in the loop, and it's still a sort of one track thing, but you're very much like handing over like a specification to the thing and then asking it to do something. That then sort of progresses into more sort of agentic swarms and review processes. So instead of you just reviewing the code, you can set up something that looks back at the code that the agent has just written, and then it gives it a critique, and then it reruns through a cycle and, you know, to try and improve itself. You can obviously set up skills and things like that now, where you can say to, like specific sort of personas. There's lots of different terms at the moment that are being used slightly differently with different things. But like, you have agents, which are sort of personas that occupy like a review agent or a coding agent. But then you've got skills, which are sort of like between the two, but they're slightly more expansive in the sense you can have tools and things that the agent can use. So like, you're a review agent, and then you can, read files with this, or you can edit files in this way, and I want you to do it in a specific format. And then you can sort of have all of these processes like working towards each other, right? So you orchestrate, right? And I think this is the key thing that's sort of changing, where we're moving from, as engineers, we're sort of used to a sort of deterministic process. And I also think this is where data engineering has like maybe like a level up above software engineering, right? Because with software engineering, it's very much like you're a deterministic process. Like I put something in here and I want this thing to come out the other end. And the key thing that I care about is making sure that that's consistent and correct, right? And then you're generating the data off the back of that, right? So software is, development of software is very much like you're creating the things that create the data. Whereas data engineering is very much like the data already exists, and you need to find the information in the data and structure that data in a way that makes that information easy to find and easy to sort of present to an end user. But there is always like a level of not inconsistency, but sort of unknown with that sort of process, right? You're trying to unpick it all, and it's not as deterministic as sort of a software thing, because, the data you get in is always doing weird stuff. It's like the system that you've ingested it from is not always going to be following rules that are sometimes understandable, right?
I think we have all seen that when we've ingested data and something's come along, we're going, what on earth is this? But that's where Genie Zero Ops might come in, but that's a whole other conversation. So.
But the fact of the matter is that as a data engineer, you're sort of used to dealing with the sort of unknown and the weird, right? And so, and the non-deterministic side of it, right? And so we're sort of in this process now where you have your deterministic sort of code that, we've all sort of grown up with and we've worked with for years, and this non-deterministic sort of thing, which is give this agent something and I'm going to ask it to do a thing, and it's going to generally do what I want it to do, but never quite in the way that I potentially would have done it myself, or consistently, if I run the same process multiple times, right, I'm not going to get like exactly the same results out. And these LLMs are effectively just, we see them as personas because we interacted with them as language, right? But they are effectively just statistical models, right? So what you're trying to do is set up the statistics in a way that give you the most likely outcome that you want. But they line up most of the outcome you're looking for, as opposed to like saying, I do this thing and I expect this result, right? And so the way we've changed over these even in the last year, is that you have like a process that is non-deterministic, and then a way of like orchestrating that process and wrapping things around that process in order to determine that the result you get is sort of what you wanted, right? And then you sort of tweak your levers and it comes out. That's where all of these sort of harnesses have gone to, so you've got Claude, you've got Codex, you've got GitHub Copilot. They're all sort of following that same pattern, and they're becoming more complex, and we're becoming more orchestrators of things as opposed to doers of things, right? And then Omnigent, I think, is that next level up, right? Which is like what you're saying is, hey, I have all these different things running and they don't really talk to each other at the moment. So you imagine it like a tree structure, right? You put in a thing at the top and then it sort of branches out going down as the sort of processes sort of take hold and they do stuff, and you're tracking that process. If you want to do that across multiple things, or you want to be able to compare two different processes together to see which one is better, you sort of can't do that at the moment unless you sort of copy the prompts over and all the skills and everything, and you try and replicate them in all the different things. And they're all slightly different, So GitHub Copilot does it slightly differently to Claude. Claude does it like differently to Codex. There's some sort of level of sharing, like sort of agents MD and stuff like that, sort of specifications and sort of methods of like making sure these things stay consistent, but they're not completely sort of in parity. You can't completely just switch things across from one thing to another. Whereas what Omnigent does now, as far as I can understand it, with obviously it's very new. We're all sort of trying to get used to it.
Hot off the press, all we've seen in the keynotes.
Yeah, is that you can set these things up at the top that have a sort of commonality, and you can specify them, and then it takes away the that bit of trying to sort of make it work with each one, right? You could set up an agent that does your code, and you could then run it in Claude, or you could run it in Codex, or you could run it in Copilot, but you don't have to rewrite it in all three of them, right? Which is quite powerful. Or you can have processes that are in one that then, because it does that thing better, and then the results can get passed to another thing that can then sort of carry on. There's some really nice stuff in it, actually. When I've looked through it, there's thing called Poly, which is like a sort of, they've tried, I don't know how close they are to like getting like the sort of IP thing here, because it looks quite similar to the sort of layout of Claude, right, in the way that it's laid out. But it's like a sort of terminal, like a CLI agent that sort of sits, and you can use it to like obviously pass down to different things, but you can also set up things where you can debate across the different. So you can say, well, I want you to do one thing, you to do the same thing, and then do comparisons across to see which one's doing things better, which is really nice. So you can obviously then experiment with the different models that are in these different proprietary systems and see which ones are getting you the best result, and then compare those results and combine them so you end up with a better process. So if we go back to what we were saying before, this sort of orchestration model, trying to set up the sort of statistics so that they give you a good result. You can try that now across all these different things to see which one handles which task best, and then pass those things up, and then have sort of combined result at the top. That's the combination of all of these things together, which is pretty nice, I think.
So there's a lot of complex bits and pieces in there, because we're obviously talking lots of LLMs, lots of agents doing lots of different things. We've got Omnigent sat on the top. We've got Omnigent's getting them to argue with each other almost. Lots of things like that. But if I'm new to all this agentic stuff, and we're sort of referring to some people not really knowing what it is. So if you've got somebody new to all this agent stuff, how would you say to them, okay, you've set up your new LLM, you got your agent. Would you suggest they go and put Omnigent over the top of it straight away? Or are they going to need to spin up a few? Whereabouts does it sit? When do they need to start using Omnigent?
Yeah, I think it's more of an advanced process, right? I think when I'm sort of trying to coach people through this, and like, I mean, I find it funny because like, you're coaching people through this, and like, obviously there's people now that are sort of saying, hey, we are the experts in these things, but like we're the experts in these things for like literally the last 6 months, right? You know what I mean? We're like, some people have been using it long for the last couple of years, but no one's been like doing this longer than like 2 years or so, right? Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's like dedicated, right? I think there's different levels of sort of adoption, right, over time. But, a lot of people now are coming in and going, oh God, I can't ignore this anymore. Right. Okay. What are we doing? And then there's people like myself that have got like sort of level experience with encoding, but even that this isn't the same as the stuff that I've been doing for 20 years, right? So, we are all just trying to work this out as we go. But the way that I've sort of approached it, and I've tried to talk to other people about it, is that start simply, right? Start with just doing sort of the plan version of this, right? Get plans together, see what the results they are, review those results yourself, understand how the nuances of how it interprets things, right? The trickiest thing with agent stuff is that it's really easy to appear to do something that makes sense, but it's subtly misunderstood something, and then it's gone off on a tangent, or it's decided that this thing is a thing and it's not actually the thing that it thinks it is, and it's done something that like is logically consistent but doesn't meet what the criteria you set it, right? So understanding those sort of nuances and how that works to start with is a key thing, I think, because as you get to these sort of levels, when you're talking about, Omnigent working across 3 different harnesses that are entirely separate, and you're setting it go, the risk of you just like doing lots of things very quickly that are terrible is quite high, right? You know what I mean?
I think we've all done that. Most of our first experiences with Chat GPT were doing crazy things.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people did that and went, oh, this is rubbish, and then walked away, right? Whereas there's more and more people now, and there's a few early adopters, and then there's more and more people have sort of stuck with it, and realizing that it's like anything, right? It's a skill you have to learn. It's not like, I think the mistake, and again, that's where it goes back to that hype thing, is that it's like we've given up our agency to agents, right? And we've stopped having to think. And it's like, no, we still have to think, and we still have to problem solve, and we still have to manage this stuff, but it's just changed now into a different way. So I think starting with that process of like understanding clearly at that level that it's easy for you to keep up, understands, right? And then potentially, I was talking about this the other day, but there's that sort of cattle versus pet sort of analogy that people use for DevOps, right? Which was at the time where you had like some kind of hand cranked sort of VM that had been set up, right? That was your pet, and it was like all your sort of effort was into maintaining that thing and like keeping it going, right? Whereas when DevOps sort of came along, the ideal of it was that you now treat these things as cattle. It's a bit of a horrible analogy, but it's like in the sense you're not attached to it anymore, and you can just destroy it and recreate it at any point, right? And that was what infrastructure became. It was like a repeatable process that you could just tear down and rebuild at any time, right? And I think software is going the same way, as opposed to this sort of, like, I've always talked about the idea of process versus artifact, right? When you see people, like, they treat a thing as an artifact, it's like a protected thing, right? We've had this for 30 years and we must maintain it, right? And you see that with data engineering pipelines, you see that with sort of software systems, and people are scared to touch it, right? Whereas if you see as like this thing as a process, you're just managing a process that is constantly changing. And I think the agentic stuff takes you closer towards that now, because it's like you can just destroy your code and rewrite it. And as long as you've got the right specifications and the right sort of things that wrap around it that tell you that what you've built matches the behavior of what you had before, you could just recreate like the whole thing, just changing it constantly. And we have to get used to the fact that this code and these things are now changing much more rapidly than they used to. So I think once you've got that sort of process down of the plan, is then also then understanding how you build things around what you're building to tell you. So like looking at evals and stuff like that, which are the way that you use, like you rate a non-deterministic system to see whether it's producing the results you expect it to produce, right? Within a sort of level of tolerance, and having like potentially deterministic tests within that as well. So you have like a score of saying, hey, this stuff over here, which I'm expecting it to do in a certain way, but it could do it in multiple different ways depending on, every time I run it, but I want to be able to say it's roughly between this thing and this thing. And then like a set of saying, hey, okay, if you produce like this specification or this set of config or this set of code, then I would expect to see these things pass, because this is the output that I'm expecting, and this mustn't change, right? And then you can use that to like loop through your generation, and then it will keep going until those things pass, and then you've ended up with a thing that's roughly what you wanted, right? And you've set those specifications. Then when you get into the Omnigent sort of thing, you're trying to do that across multiple harnesses and multiple things, and that's where it gets much more complicated. I think the observability stuff they're trying to put into that, though, makes that easier to do now. There's key things around that where if you're working with it, you can see like what agent is doing what, and you can trace it. And there's like nice things in there where you can do comments on it, or you can highlight bits of the code and say, and then add like sort of your own critique to it. So the agent will go back and change it. So there's lots of quite nice things with that. But when you get up to that level, it's keeping track of all that is the hardest part, because it's almost like, you've gone into a room full of developers and said, hey, build me this thing, and then walked out, and then you have to keep coming back in and checking, and you don't want to be going to everybody's desk and saying, hey, have you written this like I wanted to? Have you written this like what you want? Is like a general, once all this stuff has been done and what comes out, is this what I was expecting? Is this what I wanted? And then being able to sort of steer the process as opposed to driving it yourself. You're sort of trying to nudge things back online. So that Omnigent model, I think that becomes, if you try to do that right at the beginning, you just you'd lose track. It would be really difficult for you to trace. So I think get good at doing it within one harness that you're comfortable with, and then start to experiment like how you would then pass that across to different harnesses, and then build that up towards the sort of agentic sort of model.
Yeah, well, that's good, because it's where these things start to get complicated. Because if you take it right down, strip it right back down to the sort of bare bones, you've got your Claude chat interface, and you want to vibe code let's call it a vibe code web app, since we were talking about web apps earlier. So you get it to do something, you then may get it to do something else, they may then get to do something else. But if you're trying to do that across 20 different agents all doing lots of different things, it becomes crazy. So it looks like Omnigent is something that can give you that sort of control, give you that sort of power to try and get your hands on the reins or something along those lines?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two levels of that as well, because there's like you as an engineer trying to build something, right? And you're trying to build a thing and understand what it's building and make sure that it's sort of following the design that you want it to follow. And then there's the sort of senior management that want to understand like what's the cost of all this? Like, how is it, how much does it cost me? Enforcing certain policies as well. So again, that, there's going to be sort of company-wide things that you want to follow, whether it's sort of coding standards or security sort of models and things like that, right? And you want that to be, again, if you're trying to do this across different harnesses, right, you want that sort of level of experimentation and being able to like move between different things and use different tools for different purposes. But you don't want to have to then maintain 6 different policies across all those different tools, right? So the nice thing that the Omnigent gives you is you've got like the observability level, so that as a engineer, you can start to really sort of see what's happening, and you can see the different processes running in parallel. And you can see, like, you can give an agent like the same, like 2 different harnesses, the same like sort of prompts, and say, off you go. And then you can watch both of those things as they build it out. And then you can compare those things together. And, so you've got like a lot of control there, and it's really nice. But then as a leader or someone, who's worried about the cost of something, you can also set limits on the models that people are using. So like, again, that which model to use for which thing is a really key thing to start to learn. And also like the cost of, there's this idea of token maxing and stuff like that. So like, they've released like sort of Fable. So everyone's got to use that, and then you burn through all your tokens. And I've seen people do it where like there's a token limit and they're going, I've used it up in a day, I don't know what to do now. And it's like, right, okay, well, what you need to do is plan what you're going to use those tokens for, and then be prepared to be able to do the other stuff that, that once you hit that limit, right? And what Omnigent now gives you is that ability to be able to track that and like say, okay, like, set a limit on the most expensive models. And then it will warn you if you're hitting that limit. And then if you hit that limit, you have to downgrade to another model, right? Because there's a risk with that. If you downgrade to another model, you might not be able to get the...
It's like we were saying, you get your different results coming out.
Exactly. And you're halfway through doing something, right? And suddenly you've downgraded to like a lower model that might be not doing as well as the thing you wanted to do, right? The general rule is you try and use the higher models for planning so that it's got the deep thinking stuff, and then you can use the lower models for the execution, right? And so if you're in the middle of a planning phase and suddenly you've had to flip down to a lower model because you've run out of tokens, then, or you've hit the limit that has been set by your business, that might cause you problems, right? But being able to trace that and being able to see that within the harness is really useful, because that allows you to then say, okay, well, I've got this allowance that I will use for this thing, and then I will flip to this, which will mean that I'm only going to cost me this much. And you plan out that token usage. And then as a leader, you're not getting like 2 or 3 engineers that are like racing up like a massive bill. Do you know what I mean? It's like, we've released like these things that are going to make the company this much money, but it's actually cost us this much because no one's keeping an eye on the token usage. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that certainly was showing up, certainly in the demos, on the keynotes, on some of these things. I mean, the keywords they were coming out with at the conference was control, context, and choice. And I think Omnigent fits quite nicely into that. Although I did see on one of Ali's slides, he had added cost onto there as well. So it actually added another one. It lends itself quite nicely into that theme. It is about having that control, making sure you don't overspend. You see so many horror stories out there of burning through tokens, exactly as you said. But it's also given that choice. We want to use this agent for this job, this agent for this job, and we want to have the flexibility and the freedom. But then we've got context as well. So context is a big thing, and it all sort of blends quite nicely. I think Omnigent sits quite nicely in that lot.
Yeah, and I think, but it's interesting what you were saying about the sort of cost thing as well, because like, again, we're in this period where we know that the models themselves are being sort of subsidized, right, in a way to get the sort of usage and reliance to go up on them, right? And that is definitely a key thing. And we know that the costs for these things might go up over time, right? So being able to manage the cost of how much this thing is costing, how much is these things costing at the moment, and then being able to predict, right, if they up like the token costs, then how much is it going to cost us over time? But then also the fact that as these things change, having your own hosted models might become more, so the moment some of the sort of more open source models are behind the sort of higher level models, right? But only by a few months. And at a certain point, these models are going to be good enough, right? Sort of like Haiku 4.6 is good enough, right? It's not perfect, but it's good enough. And if you get something that's an open source one that's at the same level as 4.8 or Fable in a few months' time, then, the argument about why you need to pay for these proprietary things sort of changes, right? And I think that it might become more acceptable for people. And I think, again, like Databricks is really well positioned for this as well, because they have obviously their own libraries of agents and that sort of models that you can plug into, and they can manage the costing through that as well, right? But it might be that you start to then say, okay, well, we want to use these models for these purposes, and you're only allowed to use them for these purposes because we know they will work in a way that's good enough for us to get the results that we want. And then these other models are useful for these purposes, but you're only allowed to use them for that. And then you can set these sort of like limits and criteria, and it's much easier for you to manage like what, and maybe we want to host our own models over here as well. That's going to be cheaper. Yeah.
And the key point there is Omnigent. I mean, Omnigent is will be open source as well.
Yeah.
So regardless of where your model is, you can still use Omnigent with it. So you could, I mean, obviously, if you stick it all in Databricks and you just use the foundational models in Databricks, it's probably really easy to set up. But you can still use it outside. And if you have your own standalone, you could use it there. If you're using some random experiment, I don't know, maybe MIT have created some crazy thing and you want to connect to it, maybe that's what we want to do. Just for legal purposes, I know nothing about what MIT are working on.
But to go back to what you were saying, right? I've got a little pet project I haven't started yet, but it's one thing I want to try and do. You can buy like Raspberry Pis now that are set up for running agents on, and I really want to try and get one and put a local model on it and just see if I can set up something that would allow me to like utilize that for my own purposes, and without having to go through sort of a subscription to something, right? But you can sort of see where something on Omnigent becomes useful for even like that home development setup, because I can have my own model that is doing like that I can utilize for certain things, and then I want to pass things over to something that I'm paying a subscription for, but it's going to sort of save me money on tokens. Because when I was trying to think through this before this came out, I was thinking, well, you'd have to like have something that then gave you an output, and then you'd have to copy that output into like Claude or something and then get that to run. Whereas now you could wire this up, as far as I understand it, so that I was utilizing my own personal one and then taking the results and passing that into like Claude or something to do stuff with. Do you know what I mean? And you could set up like a really nice workflow with that. So, it opens up a lot of flexibility and the ability for people to make the choices they want and orchestrate things the way they want. But, to go back to what we were saying before, I think this is the key thing. Like a lot of people get sort of, I think, are getting nervous about like, oh, well, these things are just going to do our jobs and they're going to take, jobs away. And I would say that actually the thing that's changing now is that the writing of code is becoming less of a necessity, but the orchestration of how this stuff works and getting it set up so that it works well and maintaining that and managing the cost and how, you build that into like a workflow, and then you produce things that are, it's really easy to build like a really sort of basic, very quick, like sort of, or sometimes like reasonably complex sort of things that like work, but to build something that is going to consistently work and like be managed in production and not fall over and not have security risks in it and stuff, that's still a skill that is like, is really needed, and making sure these things are doing the work in the way that you want them to do safely is that's where the skills are going to become now. I think that's where we're sort of moving towards.
I had a similar conversation with Terry on the last episode where we're moving into a world whereby, yes, we could do all of this. Yes, we have all of these skills and we could do it, and we could code, and we all love to code, but it changes the view of things. So rather than saying it's going to replace our jobs, it's actually our jobs become easier, because rather than doing all the grunt work, we can expand our minds. We can get a bit more creative about how we need to, achieve a particular task. And if within the Databricks ecosystem, because things like security, particularly in the realm of apps, things like security and that already handled for us, it makes it so much easier to do things within the Databricks ecosystem than it may be doing it open source. So it's certainly the way of the future. Is just focus on what we need to do, and then all these agents are there to help us do it.
Exactly. And I think I think because I started off as like a very art sort of focused sort of background, right, is that I always find it really funny that there's this sort of like archetype of like the boring engineer, right? You know, is sort of very staid and like, you know, very sort of rigid and like, you know, strict about stuff. But actually, like, this is one of the most creative industries. Like, you know, like coding is creative, right? It is like you are creating something from nothing. You are forming like a sculpture, something, you know, you are generating. And this is just changing the focus slightly, but it doesn't change the skill, right? Do you know what I mean? And so if you're focusing on, it's potentially freeing up that sort of creative angle, right? Instead of saying, I can't do this thing because I haven't got time to write it, you could say, I can do these things and I could see whether it works now, and then I can throw it away if it doesn't quite do what I want it to do. You know what I mean? There's that sort of cycle of speed of repetition, I think, has become like much quicker in that feedback loop, right? Is everything we do is iterative, right? That is the whole point of like development practice, right? Is like, you know, repetition of things and improvement as you go. This allows you to do that much more quickly. And I still think the impact of that hasn't really quite come out yet. You know, I was having this conversation with someone internally about this around, you know, all of our processes like agile and stuff like that are sort of built around a certain sort of sense of concept of how we build software and stuff. And now these things are not necessarily chucking it out the window, but they're forcing us to reassess all of that because the speed of what we can do has increased, right? But the speed of how we can dig ourselves a very big hole has also increased. So, you know, it's like trying to balance that out now and make sure that, and again, I think, you know, to keep this sort of back on the Omnigent point, I think these are the sorts of tools that are going to become necessary because the main problem that we have with this stuff now is trying to keep track of what it's doing, you know, and it's very easy for these things to look like they're doing something that you want it to do when it's not quite doing what you want it to do. You know, it's how you sort of manage that steering is really, really important.
So last point, and this one is going to be a little bit of a curveball for you. Databricks have a way of releasing a product and then it evolves rapidly, particularly over 12 months. We've seen that time and time again. So with Omnigent just being released, how do you think that might evolve going forward in the future? And is there anything you would like to see it doing? Or is it just a case of, look, at the moment, we just need to wait and see and understand what it's doing before we can then drive what it needs to do next?
Yeah, so I think the thing that's interesting is that like we've spent a lot of time obviously talking through Omnigent and the different capabilities it's got, right? But we've been focusing a lot on the coding aspect of it and how it's creating code and how you're managing different actions it's doing. But obviously when you've got this embedded into Databricks, then it's going to be also what can it do with the data, right? And obviously this being, you know, focusing on data, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when you mix the capabilities of like having the sort of Databricks centric AI capabilities on the data itself, as well as what you can build to support those sort of data operations, right? So you've got the things that you're going to be building to manage your data, but then also applying the agent and those actions on analyzing the data, utilizing, you know, finding new information in it, finding ways of helping to ease the way you're going to join things together. You're going to link that data, the insights you can get from that, and then how you can sort of link those things together between the insights you're getting from the data and then the code that you can generate to support those insights. That I think is where it's going to be interesting to see where that goes and how being able to orchestrate across multiple agent harnesses and being able to hand off things. So you've got things that maybe are more focused and better for development practices, and then the stuff that's within Databricks itself that's going to be more focused on the data side of things. And that, you know, you want that proprietary information to say sandbox inside Databricks. You don't want to be handing stuff backwards and forwards, but you have the ability then to have that communication bridge within Omnigent that you can control from a security perspective as well. So you're very clear about what things can access what information, but you can still potentially pass things backwards and forwards between different harnesses that are, you know, maybe more leaning towards different things. I think that's where it's going to be really interesting to see when, you know, you have that sort of combination and being able to use it really embedded within the Databricks ecosystem.
So one to watch for the future then.
I think so, yeah.
Thank you for joining me, Adam, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of the Data Hot Seat. A huge thank you to Adam for breaking Omnigent down so brilliantly. I think what I'm taking away from today is that this one is easy to overlook in a week full of big, shiny announcements. But for anyone serious about building agents at scale, it might just be the most important piece of the puzzle. As always, if today's episode got you thinking, share it with someone in your team who's in the middle of an agent build right now. And if you want to go deeper on anything we've covered, you know where we are. From all of us here at Advancing Analytics, until next time. The Data Hot Seat.